Well, good morning, everyone. How are we doing today? That was good. I'm John Mann, Director of Education for Lakeside, and the theme for this week is the common good. And I'd like to welcome Dr. Rebecca Monteleone to Lakeside, along with Phyllis Scheidenbauer and Darius Cunningham. Rebecca is an assistant professor of disability studies at the University of Toledo. Her research, teaching, and practice focus on centering the expertise of people with disabilities in fields including technology design, healthcare, and journalism. And today's session is the Plain Truth Project, making inclusive and accessible news media with, by, and for people with intellectual disabilities. The lecture will discuss the Plain Truth Project initiative they created to bring together journalists and people with intellectual disabilities to make the news more inclusive. I do ask if you please mute your cell phone ringers and help me in welcoming Rebecca, Phyllis, and Darius.
Hi everyone, it's really nice to be here with you all today. I think that we're a small group, so I think I'm happy to make this kind of conversational as we move through what we want to talk about today. But as John said, we're here to talk to you about an initiative that we have called the Plain Truth Project, which brings together journalists, researchers, and people with intellectual and developmental disabilities to think about how we can make our media not just more accessible to people with disabilities, but more representative of what the lives of people with disabilities are actually like. So what we're going to talk about today, we'll think a little bit about what the media could be doing differently, but we'll also think about what we as consumers can be doing differently when we're reading news about disability and how we can be a little bit more focused on kind of what sorts of stories we should be engaging with and what sorts of stories we'd like to see more of. So as we move through our presentation today, if this is helpful for anyone, if you'd like to take a closer look at any of our slides, because we will be talking about some of the research that we do, and there'll be quotes and things like that, that if you have a phone, you can do the QR code here, and you'll be able to zoom in on any of our slides. All right, so our plan for today, we're going to kind of answer these couple of questions, right? So why should we care about making the news more accessible? What's the point of this? What's the consequences if we don't do that? Why should we include self-advocates with developmental disabilities as part of this project, which Phyllis and Darius, who are going to introduce themselves in just a minute, are two self-advocates with developmental disabilities who work as consultants on our project. And then we'll talk a little bit about what do people with developmental disabilities have to say about the news, about the way that disability appears in the news, about the kind of language that people use to talk about disability in the news, about things that we should be doing better. And then what can we do, both as, if you work in the media, what can you be doing differently, but also as consumers of news, what could we be doing differently? So before we get into that, I just want to introduce our team really quick. So the Plain Truth Project, we've been around since 2020. We came out of actually a collaboration between myself and some journalists at the newsroom ProPublica. So now our core team are two journalists, Amy Silverman, who is the executive producer of the show at KJZZ, which is based in Phoenix, Arizona, Bina Raghavendran, who is an editor at the New York Times, Phyllis Schmidbauer and Darius Cunningham, who are consultants with developmental disabilities on the project, and then myself, I'm an assistant professor of disability studies at the University of Toledo. So that's us, that's our core team. We have a couple of other folks who work on the project as well, but as you can see, we're coming from a lot of different kinds of expertise. Some of this is lived expertise, some of this is applied expertise, working as journalists, working in the media, and some of this is academic expertise. Okay, so I want to start with just a question, and like I said, I think it'd be nice to make this kind of conversational if possible, and I'll restate anything that anybody says if you have something to shout out. So I want to start by just asking this question. So how do we see people with disabilities showing up in the news right now? What kinds of stories do you see, if any at all? Where do we see disability in the news? human interest stories, often local news stories. These will often be the kind of, if you're watching your evening news, there'll be the stories that show up in the last 2 minutes where they're like, there was a community event with people with disabilities. For example, the story that you were talking about, Phyllis, where the Blade featured the send-off, the Special Olympics Summer Games for Ohio happened last week, and there was a story in the Toledo Blade that featured the athletes as they were getting on the bus and going down to Columbus for those summer games, right? So human interest stories. Where else do we see disability show up in the news?
When an accident happens.
When an accident happens?
Somebody in a wheelchair that gets.
Right, so we often see people with disabilities showing up as kind of victims in the news, right? Whether there's a tragedy or some kind of accident or something like that that's coming up, right? So those are kind of the two big categories, right? We don't really see people with disabilities appear a lot of other places in the news. And so how I might categorize those two things are this way. We often see people with disabilities show up as somebody else's good deed, right? So I have a screenshot of a couple of different news stories that are all from the last 6 months, right? So teen with Down syndrome doesn't have a date to prom, so friends hatch a plan, right? This is a pretty common kind of human interest story that we see where it's like, oh, somebody who is not disabled is doing some kind of nice thing for someone who has a disability. The other one on the other side, strangers befriend man with Down syndrome after mom offers to pay someone to spend time with him. Right? So again, we get this kind of good deed narrative where the person with the disability is kind of just like an object that other people get to kind of put their good feelings on, right? So that's our kind of one category of disability we often see. And the other one is as a passive victim, right? So it's either this tragedy or this inspiration, right? Those are the kind of two big buckets that we see. So the examples, again, these are from the last 6 months or so. This one says, disabled in danger, 6-year investigation highlights abuses of intellectually disabled. Whistleblowers call out California group home for abuse against disabled residents, right? So we have these kind of two kinds of ways that we see disability: tragedy, inspiration. And very rarely in either of these kinds of stories are we hearing from people with disabilities themselves, right? So often you're getting quotes from the girl's friends, right? Or her parents, right? This person's mom, right? Or from professionals or lawyers or caregivers or doctors, right? All of these other people get to talk about what disability is and what it means to live with a disability. And very rarely do people with disabilities get to talk about themselves in the news media. That's a problem, right? So why is this a problem? The news is how we learn about ourselves. It's how we learn about other people, particularly people we don't have a whole lot of connections with. And so when we have non-disabled journalists making a lot of assumptions about people with disabilities, and that's what gets kind of spread to the wider public, that just perpetuates a whole bunch of assumptions and misconceptions and myths, right? And when we rely on parents and professionals to provide those quotes to be our sources when we're talking about disability in the news, then we don't hear from people with disabilities themselves, right? And so we don't get the kind of lived experience. And so often, again, we're working around a lot of misconceptions. And these are stories that don't always reflect people's lived experiences, right? People with disabilities have more to life than being somebody's inspiration or somebody's tragedy, right? There is a lot of different kind of lived experience that we're just completely missing if these are the only two kinds of stories about disability we see. And then the kind of secondary problem that we'll talk about when we think about accessibility is that we're also making a whole lot of news stories about disability that people with developmental and intellectual disabilities can't read or understand, right? And so how are we talking about disability in a way that's going to actually connect with the communities that it impacts? And so that's going to be something we talk about today as well. So just a few other things to kind of set the scene before I pass it over to Phyllis and Darius. So why does it matter that we have good representation of disability in the news? So bad representation leads to discrimination, right? So just one example of this is there was a recent study that was done at the University of Indiana that said that I believe it was 60% of the general public think that people who have significant mental illness are more likely to be violent than people without significant mental illness. And actually, the opposite is true, that people with significant mental illness are more likely to be victims of violence, right? And so because of that, because there's this assumption, because we have news stories about a person with a significant mental illness perpetuating some kind of violence, all these kind of myths that exist, right? That people with significant mental illness are more likely to face discrimination, to face bias, to be injured, to be victims of violence in public because of this kind of misconception that exists. The other thing that I think is important here is when we're thinking about developmental disability and intellectual disability, people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are already excluded from their communities in big ways, right? So, I mean, up until 20 years ago, the standard was for people with developmental disabilities to live in institutions, right? We're not that far removed from that. And so not having access to what's going on in the news or what's going on in your community is just another way in which you are disengaged from your public, right? And it's another way that you are excluded. And we know, I mean, we have also research about this, that people who are engaged regularly with their local news are also much more likely to be engaged with their community in kind of practical ways too. And so getting access to the news actually is an entry point into your community. And I mean, just a couple of other obvious things. Accessibility is a right, right? There is a law that exists that says that you must have access to things, right? The Americans with Disabilities Act. There's also something called the Plain Writing Act of 2010 that says that any information that's coming from the federal government also has to be written in a way that is accessible to people. It's not really how things work typically. Who the kind of public is in that definition is a little bit hard to parse, right? Often that doesn't include people with intellectual and developmental disability or people with limited access to literacy, right? So accessibility has to extend beyond things like thinking about ramps and Braille and sign language interpreters. Those things are very important, but having cognitive access, right? Having access to information is part of accessibility. And so that's something that we want to really highlight in this work too. The other thing I just want to highlight, that if we think about access to the news broadly, if we're thinking about this kind of idea of access to information, that benefits a whole lot of people, right? There are 6 million people with intellectual disabilities in the United States, but there are also people with learning disabilities. Possibly as high as 20% of the population has a learning disability that impacts their ability to read. English language learners, or people with limited access to education, right? If we think differently about how we present crucial information, right? Like the news is not superfluous. This is important, critical information. If we think differently about how we present that information, then we benefit millions and millions of people. And then the last thing I want to highlight is that, and I mentioned this before, this is a justice issue, right? People with intellectual disabilities have had their experiences and their knowledge invalidated. They've been separated from their communities. This is an image from a photo essay from the 1950s called Christmas in Purgatory, which was inside of the Willowbrook Institution. It shows people with intellectual disabilities kind of just slumped over in chairs doing nothing. We're not so removed from this history, right? And so we need to be thinking critically about how do we keep people in our communities? How do we invite people into our public discourses? Because if we don't do that, if we invalidate the knowledge of people with intellectual disabilities or invalidate the experiences of people with intellectual disabilities, we're not so far away from institutionalization or restrictive guardianship arrangements or sterilization, right? These things are not so far away from where we are right now. Okay. So what are we doing about it? So like I said, we are the Plain Truth Project. We've been around for about 4 years. We do a whole range of different things. We do some research, which I will share with you after Phyllis and Darius present about self-advocacy. We also do workshops. We recently had a workshop in Washington, D.C. with journalists, about 40 journalists and self-advocates with intellectual disabilities coming together and trying to come up with some best practices. We do accessibility training and consulting. Particularly, we do a lot of work on plain language, on how to write in ways that are more accessible to people with intellectual disabilities. And then we do some public events. We do storytelling events, which Phyllis and Darius will tell you about in a little bit. And this is just a slide that has some of the scope of what we do here. So there's a public storytelling event up here. And we do these public storytelling events because we believe really crucially that people with intellectual disabilities are the experts of their own lives. But that's not something that the general public knows a whole lot about. And so having these public storytelling events where people share stories about their lives is a way to kind of shift that metric a little bit, to think about that differently. This is a picture from our DC workshop where we were bringing together journalists and people with intellectual disabilities. Our website has a database on how to write in plain language. There's all sorts of different guides for that. There's a screenshot of some research that we published last year. We have a podcast called Telling It Our Way, which is a series of stories by people with intellectual disabilities about different subjects like work and school and life and family and so forth. That's with WGTE, which is the Toledo NPR station. And then there's an example of some easy read over here where it's a story that is written with one sentence at a time, and then there's an icon associated with each of those sentences to help clarify what the meaning is. But, okay, this is the kind of work that I think we can't do in solitude, right? It can't be me as a researcher doing this work. It can't just be the journalists working at the New York Times doing this work. It has to be a collaboration between a whole bunch of different people. And so just to really emphasize that point, I want to invite Phyllis and Darius have prepared a presentation about why we need to include self-advocates in this work. So I'm going to pass it over to them, and they are going to share their presentation.
Hello, today we're talking about self-advocacy in journalism and why journalists should work with people with disabilities. My name is Phyllis Schneeberger. I'm a self-advocate. I'm president of People First, the Sergeant Officer for Salute, and also a lightning leader in People First, leadership for Special Olympics, and I'm a self-advocate for other people.
I am Darius Koyam. I am a self-advocacy. I am vice president of People First, of members of Salute and Lightning Leaders, and I for disability, and I want to teach people about racism and domestic violence.
We are part of the Plain Truth Project. We give our opinions as self-advocates. We help do research and give presentations.
Why is it important to include self-advocacy with disability?
There are a lot of myths about people with disabilities that are not right. Myths like, we can't live our normal life. Wrong.
We can't speak up for ourselves. Wrong.
We can't have friendships or relationships. Wrong.
We can't help others. Wrong.
It's okay to make fun of us. Wrong. As self-advocates, we stick up for ourselves and others who can't stick up for themselves. We go to the State House, City Council to advocate for change, do outreach in our community, like our transition fairs.
As self-advocacy, we make friends with lots of different kinds of people from around the country, go to the meetings and learn about our rights and community, teach others about advocacy.
Why should journalists work with people with disabilities?
Here is what we think about journalism we need to know.
Journalists need to know what to say and not what to say. For example, don't say the R word. Don't call us slow, stupid, or dumb. That's not true.
Don't to trust us. Different talk to us. Don't just talk to others and other people about us.
We can do anything. We can take care of our pets, our homes, our money, family, ourselves. Needing help sometimes does not mean can't do things.
Learn about the issue. I care about people with disability in sports, guns and violence, and others of violence, where there are medical issues in the Middle East. Welcome new people in America.
I care about politics and elections, transportation, COVID-19, crime in the U.S., self-advocacy. I also care about the climate change and the hurricanes. We want to see better stories with people with disabilities in the news.
We want to see stories about disability in sports, living in a community, fight for our rights, live healthy and long live, use new technologies, working in jobs we love.
We want to see stories about people with disabilities creating arts and films, working and helping others, changing our communities to do more accessibility, take care of our homes and pets, and organizations like People First, Salute, and Special Ed Leadership.
Thank you.
Oh no, hold on, Darius.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
The most important thing to remember, we have normal lives.
Sorry about that.
We're people like everyone else.
Sorry.
You're fine.
Okay.
That's fine. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm a nice guy.
Say thank you.
Thank you.
So before we move into the next piece where I want to share a little bit about some of our research, I just wanted to take a minute to pause to see if there were any questions or comments for Phyllis and Darius about either their work on this project or what they talked about here.
It's like a fair we go, like we're gonna have advocacy fair in November. It's like a fair where we go to and like Special Olympics, they have a table, we have a table for Salute. And we tell people about what we do for like sports, leadership, getting people to sign for more sports. Some people to sign for advocacy. We have a friend named Zoe and Ryan back home, and they're finally gonna sign up for Salute juniors because they're younger than us.
Yeah, right. Transition fairs are for people who are kind of coming out of high school and who are stepping kind of into the adult world for the first
Yeah,
time.
we have kids starting at 8 years old, but now they're part of the Special Olympics with us. They weren't before. So we went to, like, we do cheer. They're with us on cheer instead of having to have a separate team. And they also come to track practice the same day we do with their coach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's like you're sharing information with the next generation of self-advocates coming up. Yeah. Are there any other questions or comments for Phyllis and Darius about their piece of this project?
How would you like to see people with disabilities that are not very noticeable, or maybe that are invisible disabilities, represented in the media? Or how would you suggest that the media talk about people with disabilities that are more hidden?
It's a great question.
Okay. I like to see a change against racism and gay people and LGBTQ, and I think everybody should have the rights to be in sports. Anybody.
So I think the question is more about, so somebody who, if you just look at them, you might not know that they have a disability. And so how do we make sure that those people get represented in the news or in storytelling or things like that?
Some people can sign up for storytelling or the film fest and see how they do. Sometimes the storytelling takes a little bit, take a class and learn what your life is like.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree that I think that having these opportunities to have people speak for themselves are the way that we kind of create more public awareness around, because there are lots of people with disabilities who sometimes need support or could use support who don't get it because they're not perceived as having a disability. And so just having an opportunity for people to be able to speak for themselves, like these public storytelling events, like sourcing with people with disabilities themselves when you're telling a story, I think is a way to do that. And I think that we've seen, I think that news coverage around long COVID has been a good example of ways that we can do this differently, right? Because I think there has been a lot of attention on people's lived experiences of sort of post-viral disability, right? That has felt a little bit different than what we've seen in the past. And it's often coming from journalists themselves who have experienced a chronic disease or something like that. And so I think there are some examples that we're starting to see. Are there other questions about this piece before we jump into the next? Okay. So you've heard a little bit from Phyllis and Darius, who are consultants on the project. We have also done work with a number of other people with developmental disabilities to try to get a sense of kind of what is the kind of general experience of consuming the news. What are the big barriers that exist to accessible news right now? And so what we'd like to share with you now is a little bit of our research. So we conducted a number of focus groups over the last year with people from all around the country with developmental disabilities about where do you get your news? What are the barriers that you face when you are trying to get your news? What do you think about the way that disability shows up in the news? And so those are the big things I want to share with you. This is the paper. This paper is currently under review and going to be published next year, but it's called You've Got to Either Adapt to Us or Get Out of the Field. And it's about people's experiences. You know, often what we found, we interviewed about 25 people. Almost all of them had appeared in human interest stories and no other kind of news, which is amazing, right? Because that is, the research shows people with developmental disabilities show up on average more often than non-disabled people in the news, but the quality of those stories is often very, very poor, right? And so people are talking about their kind of experiences with that as part of this work too. So to give you a sense of what we did, we conducted 5 focus groups around the country last year, 21 participants between the ages of 19 and 67. So we got a really, really good age range here. Mostly women, 57% women, 33% male, 5% identified as gender fluid, and 5% didn't disclose. And then 75% white, 10% black, 5% Asian, 10% didn't disclose. And so we have a fairly representative example of the United States, skewing a little bit more toward women, skewing a little bit more toward folks who identify as white. And then all of these folks self-identified as having an intellectual or developmental disability. So a little bit about what we did here. First, we created all of our accessible materials to make sure that people knew what they were consenting to when they were doing this research. Sorry. This is just an informational sheet, a little shot of one of our informational sheets where we showed pictures of ourselves and said, these are the people doing this research. Here is what we're doing. We're going to ask you about X, Y, and Z. We're going to talk to you in a focus group. And so we wanted to make sure that all of our materials were accessible from start to finish. So even in our publication that is going to be coming out, there is an accessible version of that publication coming out as well, because if we're going to argue that we think that information needs to be accessible to all people, we better be making our information accessible too. So the major themes that we found, also there's these images, these cartoon images throughout. These were created by an organization called Make Studio, which are artists that we commissioned, all of whom have intellectual and developmental disabilities, who created all of these illustrations for all of our projects. So the major themes that we found were around how do people respond to the news? You know, what are the kind of feelings that come up for people when they're looking at the news? What are barriers to access? How is disability represented? And what do we need to do differently? So starting with those kind of emotional responses to the news, I don't think these are surprising. These are the kinds of emotional responses that many of us have to the news right now, overwhelmingly negative, right? So sadness, fear, anger, distress, or boredom. What we found, though, was that these emotional responses were often very, very strong, right? Strong enough to dissuade people from wanting to engage with the news at all, right? So if every time I turn on the news, it is so upsetting to me that I cry, I'm not going to engage with the news, right? And again, I don't know that this is a finding that is specific to people with developmental disabilities. We live in a world where often our news is very difficult to process. But this is something that I think is notable because, I'm going to talk about this in just a second, because that emotional response that someone had to the news, sometimes the people in their lives determined that that was enough of a reason to cut them off from the news at all, right? So, oh, you were upset when you watched the news, we're not going to watch the news in the house anymore, right? And so all of a sudden you don't have access to your information anymore. So one quote about that, about this kind of barrier, this gatekeeping barrier that we saw, this was a young man in his 20s. He lived at home with his parents. He said, I try to watch some of the news. My parents won't let me because there's killing people and raping, and there's a lot of bad people doing bad stuff. Like, I know that bad people are doing bad stuff. I'm getting old like my parents, but I'm not watching the news like them. Right? And so he expressed this kind of several times throughout the focus group, that he wanted to know more about what was going on in the world, but his parents had determined that, you know, there's bad stuff happening on the news, so you don't get access to that information anymore. And so when we're talking about accessibility barriers, we're not always talking about things like technical barriers that can be solved by speech to text or brailing or access to sign language interpreters and so forth, right? There are these attitudinal barriers that exists too. The other things that we found that came up was when you have a lot of complex writing or unfamiliar words or concepts. A lot of people talked about this in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, because all of a sudden we had this like whole new vocabulary that we were using on the news that we all just pretended we knew what it meant, the distinction between quarantining and isolating and so forth, right? And so a lot of people talked about, you know, when the news presents all of these terms and doesn't explain what they mean, then there's no way for me to understand what I'm supposed to do with that information. So we have one quote here where someone said, I have to ask my people, like my staff members, what does this mean? And so again, we get to this kind of human element of this, where if I need to rely on someone else in my life to be able to translate the news for me, I need to make sure that that person is there and that person understands the news themselves, right? And so if I'm thinking about reliance on staff, for example, I don't know how familiar you are all with the disability landscape right now, but in Ohio and also around the country, we're having a staffing crisis in disability services. There is a severe staffing crisis where often people are not getting access to the staff that they need on a day-to-day basis. I see you nodding, Phyllis. I know you and Darius can speak to this personally.
Yes, sometimes we are so short on staff. We don't have enough staff working, but my company that we have finally hired a couple new people, so we have staff now. And I know I have a friend named Renee. She was on the news. She didn't have enough people taking care of her. It was hard for her. And I have friends that it's hard for them sometimes. They don't always have help.
Right. I mean, it's like, and it's to the point where it's like people are not getting the assistance they need to bathe, let alone someone who can help them decipher what was on the 5 o'clock news, right? And so this kind of expectation that there's always going to be someone else there to take care of it, right? I think that often we have this perception that people with developmental and intellectual disabilities are just like always surrounded by other people. And that's really disempowering, and it really undermines independence, but also it's just not true, right? And so if you're making an assumption that someone else is there to explain it, then we can see that that's not always going to work out. Some other things that came up was the speed at which we present the news. So if we're thinking about watching news on television, you might instinctively think like, oh, listening or watching the news on TV is going to be more accessible than reading it. But what we found from people was the way that news stories are constructed often makes it really hard to tell when we're going from one story to the next. And so often people are being like, I don't understand what we're talking about, because we were talking about the president for a second, and now we're talking about COVID-19, and now we're talking about a hurricane, and I don't know how all these pieces fit together, and we're moving kind of very quickly through all of this information. And often the way that the news is presented on television, you'll get like 2 minutes of a story here, and then half an hour later, you'll get the other 5 minutes of that story, right? And so the way that those things are broken up, that doesn't actually help anybody understand what's going on, right? And so I think this was a surprising finding, because I think my instinct would also be that, you know, watching the news is more accessible than reading the news. But you don't have control over how fast that information is coming at you when you're watching the news or listening to it on the radio. And then we had this problem with misinformation, which I think is a problem that we're all facing right now. Just kind of not knowing what information to trust or what news sources to trust. So the quote here says, and then, you know, I don't know just to me that COVID stuff it was all to me it was, you know, misleading sometimes to me. I would hear different sides, everybody's sides to it, so I didn't know what to believe. And this was a pretty common finding amongst our focus groups, that people would say, well, sometimes my coworker tells me this thing, but I saw this thing on social media, but I heard this thing on the CNN app, and I just have no idea what's true or not, or who I'm supposed to go to find that information. And so, again, I don't think this is a problem that's specific to people with developmental disabilities, but it is a problem that is exacerbated by not having access to accessible information. And then the other thing that came up was cost and some technological barriers, right? So this is a quote from one of our respondents. She lives independently in the community, but she lives in subsidized housing. And she says, I didn't have cable. I didn't have nowhere to look to see what's going on. I didn't have no way. If I had cable, that would be a different story. And I didn't have bunny ears. Mine won't work. And so thinking about actually having access to the information to begin with. So we know, for example, that people who live in group homes or nursing home settings are much less likely to have regular access to Wi-Fi, or regular access to streaming services, or regular access to cable, let alone the technology to actually access those things in the way that they might need, right? So we had one respondent in this focus group. She lived in a 10-bed group home. They had Wi-Fi, but the Wi-Fi, the broadband wasn't enough that she could actually like stream the news, right? She couldn't stream anything. She couldn't access the internet at some times of the day, because it was internet that was being spread out across 10 different people and their 10 different technological needs. And then layered on top of that, she was blind, and she didn't have access to anything except like a manual cell phone and a radio, right? And so her access to information was really, really limited. Do y'all have anything about barriers that you want to add? Things that make it hard to get access to the news before I move to the next one?
Oh,
I know.
Go ahead.
I know Jo Rita had a hard time getting her Wi-Fi back on at where she lives. Our friend Jo Rita, she had no Wi-Fi for a while, so she couldn't even see the news or hear the news.
Yeah, right. So she's a person who lives in an assisted living community, and they, you know, ostensibly have Wi-Fi, but she wasn't able to get access to anything. She's another one of these cases where the bandwidth wasn't enough that she could actually use it in a meaningful way. And then I think about things like paying for cable or paying for streaming services or those kinds of things, and the expense that's associated with that. Darius, did you want to add something too?
Yes, you're talking about the news and stuff. On the news, they talking about restaurant shortage, and I was a person who lost my job, and I found a new job.
Yeah, right. I mean, so that's another thing that comes up on the news a lot, is things about the economy, right? So restaurants closing and things like that. That's
Stores
something.
closing.
Yeah, that's something you experienced personally. Yeah, thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
So then the next piece of this we wanted to talk about with people was, what do you actually think about the way that disability shows up in the news, right? So there were a couple of different things that people wanted to see more of, and there were a couple of different things people noticed about the kinds of representations they see now. So the first was that there was this huge desire to see more information about advocacy and awareness, right? That we have this issue where many people without disabilities just simply don't know anything about disability at all, and that impacts people's day-to-day lives. So this quote here says, "I know there's not much coverage on certain disability because there's stigma around it. So I just wish there was less stigma about this kind of stuff and more acceptance, being able to learn and being able to adapt to others," right? And so that kind of story doesn't fall in either of our two big buckets, right? It doesn't fall into our inspiration, human interest stories or our tragedy stories, right? There's something else here that people feel is missing, right? This educational component. So another thing that came up quite a lot is the kind of language that gets used to talk about disability. And the language around disability is quite contentious for a lot of different ways. But what people were talking about here was the use of really kind of old terminology that's very outdated, that often it feels like when you hear that kind of terminology, oh, that person didn't actually talk to anybody with a disability when they wrote this story. So this quote here, I know it's quite long, so I'll read it out. There are still a lot of, especially local news stories, when they talk about disability, they might use outdated terminology to refer to certain disabilities. And that just leaves a bad taste in my mouth when the wrong words are used or because the wrong words might imply, incompetence or something that they don't intend. And I think we know what they're trying to say, but when you use the wrong words, it demonstrates just a kind of lack of awareness and maybe a lack of communication of how somebody wants to be called and how they, want their disability to be represented and referred to in the story. And so people use this as like, oh, this is a red flag to me that this journalist doesn't actually talk to people with disabilities when they write about this kind of stuff. And so actually one good example of this that comes up, I know Phyllis, you brought up a couple of examples around, being called slow or using the R word or something like that. One really persistent example that we see a lot is mental age, right? So people saying like, this person has the mind of an 8-year-old or the mind of a 10-year-old or acts like a 2-year-old or whatever that might be. That kind of terminology is actually very, very outdated because what it's doing is it's saying that this adult, you should be thinking about them as a child, right? Despite the fact that this adult has 30, 40, 50 years of life experience, right? And so there are certainly ways to say that someone needs support. There are certainly ways to say that someone has some kind of intellectual disability that doesn't immediately make you refer to them as a child or think about them as a child. Because when we think about adults like children, then we start to get paternalistic. We start to want to control their choices. We start to want to make decisions on their behalf, right? And so that's one I would say to continue to look out for. That's the one I think that I probably see the most in this kind of outdated terminology category.
She's got a question.
Oh, was there a question back there? Please. Uh-huh. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I think, so that reminds me, there is a really, really great language guide that's produced by the National Center for Disability and Journalism, where they talk about all of these kind of terms that often get used. Normal and, quote, abnormal definitely appear in there as being like, what is it that you're trying to say? What is it that you're trying to refer to here? There's no reason for this to be in here. Use the words that you mean. If you mean someone without a disability, say someone without a disability, right? And so that is a really, really excellent guide, I think, for thinking about some of those things, right? Or using language like this person suffers from something. That's another one that often comes up, right? And so you're making an assumption that somebody's suffering. Mm-hmm. Yes.
No.
Yeah, I recently saw some. Yeah. Yeah, I recently saw a conversation very similar to that about the term special needs child, right? Like it's the same kind of thing where it's like you're applying this kind of label here. And that language, I think, is still quite common. Yeah. Yeah, so what I've seen in, I think, journalism that is more aware of kind of what the discussions around disability are is that often journalists will make a point to say, this is how this person has chosen to be referred to in this article, and then maybe this other source chooses to refer to themselves in a different way, because there are certainly kind of lots of the disability community is not one big thing, right? There's no agreement on what language people use. Even that kind of distinction between person first, person with disability, and identity first, disabled person, right? There's quite a lot of variation in kind of who prefers these different terms. And so I think that to get around this issue where this person is saying, like, it's clear to me this journalist didn't talk to a person with a disability, to make it clear in the story, this is how this person wants to be referred to, and so this is the language that I'm using here. And then I think, again, this disability language style guide from the National Center for Disability in Journalism is a really, really excellent resource for even just kind of looking at it and seeing all of these kind of insidious little phrases that sneak into these kinds of stories, which you might not even think about initially as like disability language, right? But it's language that reinforces some of these ideas. All right, so then the other thing that came up in our focus group is a lot of people felt when they showed up in these human interest stories that they were being tokenized, right? They were like, somebody just wanted a picture of a person with a disability in the newspaper, and that is something that people talked about in their experiences in showing up in the media. So this quote here, this is one of my favorite ones that we had the entire set. She says, "A lot of the time, media isn't just a PR stunt or publicity. It's just something they did really, really bad. I'm sorry, I'm not somebody you can use as a rag doll or a dog to put us on a post to show us off. I'm sorry, I'm a human being with feelings." And so I think this really points to the fact that of our 21 participants in these focus groups, all of them had appeared in some kind of media story, and almost universally, those media stories were these kind of human interest stories, and that people weren't always so grateful for showing up in those stories, right? That there is this sense that, like, you seem to be using me for whatever reason, right? You seem to be wanting to portray some kind of message. Excuse me. Sorry, just 1 second. So then the next thing that we talked about were, okay, what do we do differently? What do we do better? So we were talking to all our focus group recipients, our participants. What can we do to make the news more accessible? So I don't know, Phyllis and Darius, if you want to talk about some of the ideas that you've brought forward, and then I can talk about some of these others too. How do we make the news more accessible to people with disabilities?
The internet, the newspaper, watch the news on TV, and if they can't get it, ask someone, like ask a family member, ask a friend.
Yeah, so one of the big things was having lots of different methods to be able to access the same information, right? Whether that's the internet, listening to it, watching it, being able to read it. Darius, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I want to do the language one. It's kind of sad how people has different language. They're from another country, and people need to understand what they go through. They have kids.
Yeah, so thinking about not just having like plain language in English, right, but having plain language in lots of different languages. So this project initially came out of a partnership that we had, as I mentioned, with ProPublica, the investigative newsroom, and initially started as a project to create a whole bunch of plain language translations of an investigative report they were doing on developmental disability services in Arizona. And we ended up publishing plain language versions of every single one of the stories, plain language audio versions of every single one of the stories, and then plain language audio Spanish versions of every single one of the stories to kind of think, because it was taking place in Arizona where there are large Spanish-speaking populations. So thinking about people with disabilities aren't just people with disabilities, they're also people who come from different countries. They're also people who come from different backgrounds. They're also people who come from different educational standpoints, right? So thinking about disability isn't the only thing that matters to a person. There are all of these other facets of their identity. So some of the other things that we heard about, having pictures and videos to go with written stories, thinking about including glossaries, particularly kind of at the tops of stories. So again, this came up in the context of COVID-19, which is when you're using a whole bunch of language that people might not be familiar with, rather than just defining it when you write about it buried in the third paragraph or whatever, say like this story is going to talk about this word means this, right? Having that kind of right up front. Doing plain language, which I'll show you some examples of in just a second. Having summaries at the top of all the stories. Doing hands-on applications. So this was one that I thought was a really interesting finding and something that we've tried to do a little bit more of too, right? So if you have, for example, this big investigative piece we did on developmental disability services in Arizona, we had a series of public events afterward to talk about the story. And so we invited some of the sources to come and talk about their experiences, and it was like a community conversation about what was in the story. So it created this opportunity to kind of have dialogue rather than be like, here you go, this is the finished piece, you process it yourself, right? Slower presentation, like we talked about, clearer breaks between segments, and then making sure that we're including other modes of access, right? Because people with intellectual and developmental disabilities might also be people who are blind, or people who are deaf, or people who are wheelchair users, or what have you, right? And so thinking about how all of those kinds of access should be kind of bundled together. All right, so then a couple of other things that I think are more about context. So one of the things that we found were people want more firsthand stories about disability. People are tired of having other people speak on their behalf, right? It's not about getting parents, and I mean, parents have important perspectives, caregivers have important perspectives, medical professionals have important perspectives, but those perspectives have dominated all of these stories about disability historically. So this person says, I was thinking that, yeah, we all have our own stories, and it would be we need to just be able to tell our own stories and say, hey, you know, we're out here too. And so this is part of the response that has been why we have invested so much in doing these kind of firsthand storytelling events, to think about how those kind of supplement the way that we think about news coverage. And then some advice for journalists that I think is really good as well. Like journalists, people doing interviews, it's more how you talk to us that I think kind of gives me the wrong way. I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not 5 years old. I'm not a little kid coloring in the corner. I'm a human being with feelings. Just sometimes you've got to reword the question. Just be patient. And some people are not. And unfortunately, we're not going away. We're here. And you've either got to adapt to us or get out of the field. Right? So a lot of advice, and this is something that we have started to do some workshops with newsrooms, a lot of advice for journalists on how to actually talk to people with developmental disabilities, right? Because there is a lot of paternalism, there is a lot of treating people like they are children, or treating people like they couldn't possibly answer the question that you're trying to ask them, right? And all of that is stereotype, right? All of that is myth, and so it's just about kind of finding the method. So what do we think journalists should do? We think we need to include more people with disabilities in newsrooms, not just as sources, but also as journalists, right? There are a few national kind of disability journalism fellowships, but to our knowledge, never anywhere in the United States has that been a person with a developmental disability who's won one of those. So often these are people with physical disabilities or sensory disabilities, really important perspectives, but we also think that developmental and intellectual disability is something we need to consider specifically. So how do we get people with developmental disabilities into newsrooms? And then include people with disabilities as sources for all kinds of stories, right? Because people with disabilities, as Phyllis and Darius were talking about, have a whole range of issues that they care about that aren't just disability, right? And so how do we make sure that when we're doing a story about transportation in our community, that we're including who we need to include as a relevant source for that, right? Use plain language, easy read, audio, and other accessible ways to share information. We like to think about this as like a menu, right? So have lots of different options for how to access information, and then unpack your biases and your misconceptions. So just to get into that, I promise we're almost done. Just to get into that a little bit more deeply. So when we're centering people with developmental disabilities, that, you know, it means we're still using the exact same kind of media goals that we would have around making sure that stories are accurate, making sure that stories are verifiable. So I was talking before we started about how often the pushback that we get from newsrooms is that people with developmental disabilities aren't credible, right? Which is a kind of gross thing to say. And so often newsrooms will say, like, well, we can't use that person's testimony because I don't believe it. And it's like, well, why don't you believe it? What is it that you don't believe? Let's unpack that misconception. But then also, we can use the same strategies that journalists use for every other kind of source, right? There aren't other kinds of sources, if you're just talking to a random person from the public that you immediately go, well, I 100% believe that and I don't need to verify it at all, right? It's the same process. You're still doing that verification work. And so first you gotta get past that stereotypical barrier, right? Being like, well, I don't believe this person because of some characteristic about them, right? And then just use the tools that you're already using in journalism to verify things, right? Go into documents, do background interviews with other people, right? All of those things are still available to you when you're sourcing with people with developmental disabilities. The other thing that we would recommend is, some of the things that I think are adaptable, right? So often journalists will interview people without giving them access to questions in advance. We think that if you are interviewing a person with a developmental disability, you should provide questions in advance so the person has the time to process and prepare. You might want to also think about being able to review their responses with them afterward to make sure that they are comfortable with the things that are being included. And to conduct maybe several interviews at several different points in time, right, to give people kind of more time and space. But all of those things, I think, are kind of within the realm of what it is that we do in journalism. And then thinking about accessible publication, like I said, plain language translations and summaries, videos and audio, public events, offering that kind of menu of options. I just want to quickly show you, oh, maybe I don't want to quickly show you anything. Oh, okay. A couple of examples of plain language. So this is the traditional language that was used in that story that I talked about with ProPublica, where they did an investigative study of the developmental disability services in Arizona. This is the headline and then the first paragraph. She needs a device to communicate. The state has kept it from her for 18 months. Emery, 11, has cerebral palsy and used an augmentative communication device to talk to her friends. One day, her mother turned it on and smoke came out. They make it so hard for families that they give up. So that was the original version. And then this is the plain language version of that same story. She needs a device to talk to people. Arizona has not given it to her. It's been 1.5 years. Emery is 11 years old. She has cerebral palsy. She uses a device to talk to her friends. One day, her mom turned it on and smoke came out. She said, they make it so hard for families that they give up, right? Same information, just written in a slightly different way. Another example here, this is from that same set of stories. So Kyra is autistic and profoundly deaf. She was born premature at 27 weeks, just a little over 2 pounds, which has impacted pretty much everything: eyesight, hearing, digestion, sleep patterns. A strong tremor in her hand makes it impossible for her to use American Sign Language. Her parents think she recognizes a couple dozen signs. The plain language version. Kyra is autistic and deaf. She was born early. She was very small when she was born. She has trouble seeing, hearing, eating, and sleeping. Her hand shakes, so she does not do sign language. Her parents think she knows some signs. Right? Same information, written in a more accessible way. This actually is an example. It's from that ProPublica story, but it is also from a piece that I wrote with The Pudding, which is a data visualization website, where it goes through each of those highlighted sentences and tells you why the plain language looks different than the original version and kind of what the choices are that were made. And then this is a separate piece that I did with ProPublica, where this was just the voting guide that they did. And so this was all written in plain language. And it's just an example of using bullet points and using images as a way to share that same information. This was a story that was meant for people who typically need assistance with reading and kind of what their rights are around voting if you need assistance with reading. So that's just some example of things that are already kind of in the world, right? We just need to be kind of seeing more of these kinds of things for more kinds of audiences. And then to talk about public events, I think this is an example. The public event we did with ProPublica was during COVID, so it took place on Zoom. We hired Make Studio, those artists with developmental disabilities, to do an illustration of the Zoom screen, which is what the image is here. So these public events, it's about getting creative, right? It's about recognizing that the information that we share on the news is not something that you have to process alone, right? It's not something that you have to understand on your own. We live in a community. We can communally talk about the things that are important to us as a public. This is going to take time, though, right? It's going to take time to find spaces to kind of build community together around access to the news. But we really, really think this is how the culture between journalists and people with disabilities changes. Because, I don't know, people with disabilities don't have a whole lot of reason to trust non-disabled journalists right now, right? There's been a whole history of a lot of really poor representation. And so we need to do a lot of work to kind of make things different. All right, so that's all I want to talk about. I just want to think about kind of if you are just a media consumer, you know, as a conversation, what is it that we can do differently as media consumers to work towards some of these points? So I don't know if anybody has any thoughts about that, but go ahead.
Well, we ourselves should use that simplified form of language. I'm a lawyer, and as an older lawyer, I've edited materials from younger lawyers that are almost infinitely long. And when I've asked them about it, they said, well, we thought that's what you wanted. That sounds so important.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'm an academic, so I can certainly relate to that, that I think that we are often, in many of the fields that we work in, we're trained to think that the harder it is to understand something, the smarter you are, right? And I think actually it's much more difficult to write things in meaningfully accessible ways. Like that is a skill that we should be cultivating when we're training lawyers and we're training teachers, right? Mm-hmm. And how's it going?
It's a hard slog.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly, right? And so, like I mentioned, our website, which is plaintruthproject.org, we actually have a whole database of lots of different kinds of guides for how to write more accessibly, right? And some of them are how to write easy read that's specifically for people with intellectual disabilities. Some of them are guides on how to write for a, quote, general audience in more accessible ways. And so there's a kind of whole range of different strategies available. But that's just something I want to point to that I think would be useful in that endeavor, right? We should all be working to make sure we're communicating more accessibly to people, because who do we consider to be part of our community, right? And if you're not considering all of the members of your community to be part of your community to be in conversation with, that's a problem that we need to be unpacking, right? Who doesn't get counted in public dialogues? Yeah, I don't know, does anybody else have thoughts about what we as a public can be doing? Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think that we're like pointing a lot to some of the serious consequences of this, right? So if we're making an assumption that, well, you couldn't understand this, and so you can't participate in this, whether that's voting or making a decision about your health care or making a decision about where you live or something like that, right? Those are very real consequences that people with intellectual disabilities often face, where they get this kind of response, you don't understand what we're talking about, and therefore you can't be part of that decision. But we're intentionally creating difficult communication pathways, right? I think about even just like in the disability service world, right? The number of acronyms and the amount of jargon that you have to know to be able to navigate those systems, we have made them so intentionally complex to cut out the people who are being impacted by those decisions. And so we can think differently about them, right? We can do work to make them more accessible so that people can understand the decisions that they're making, that they can be part of those decisions, because the consequences are really dire otherwise, right? I saw a hand here and then here. Go ahead.
I think that one of the things that we can do is hold journalists more accountable, okay? So they write a story, and you go, I don't understand the acronym. I don't understand this. I don't know, why did you do that? Or why did you talk about that person in that way? Or can you simplify that so that I can understand it better, and hopefully in that process everybody understands it better? I'm struck by how, if you underline the lawyer, I'm struck by how we could all benefit by the accessibility and simplification of writing and summaries and bullet points and things like that, and far simpler language, and therefore get to the plain truth through that process of simplifying that communication process. The other thing that I was struck by your presentation, thank you very much, Ray, is the fact that people do things out of love or concern maybe, and what they're doing is they don't want to see this person that they love upset, so they don't want them to watch the movie. And how can we get, we're doing these things out of love, and in essence we're hurting them in a way. And that became real apparent to me in your presentation.
Yeah.
And all I can say is that's the hard work.
Yeah, thank you for both those points. I completely agree that I think as a public we can definitely be holding journalists and newsrooms more accountable for the kind of work that they publish on disability when they publish it at all, and also the nature of how they publish that work, right? I think we can definitely apply that kind of pressure. And then to your second point, that is the hard work, right? That often kind of the well-meaning paternalism is the sort of hardest stuff to unpack. It's the hardest stuff to kind of move past, because people do care, right? People are doing things out of love. And so it often is kind of very difficult to move past that into kind of seeing something that is more empowered and more independence-driven. And you just got to keep trying, right? And engaging people with where they are, and recognizing that people are making the choices they're making not because they're trying to oppress their child or their client or whatever, right? But for reasons that I think are often seated in something really good, right? And so meeting people where they are and trying to have a conversation from there. Yeah, thank you. Is there one here?
First of all, the first response is so much what goes on is driven by company. So the things that I'm wondering about, I also know that there have to be a physical point to make sure these things happen. But I think that just in a educational setting, there are things, Cleveland's WDIC does a wonderful job on like a news roundup that, because a lot of the things that you identify are things that fit people too.
Mm-hmm.
It needs to be a summary, it needs to be, slowed down, it needs to be understanding, great. So they do a nice news roundup on a local level, there's that, but CNN 10, which is a huge big tool that's used in schools, but then there has to be a way for someone to pay for that in order for people to have access. And so I think that, I wonder, how you get funds invested to make sure these things happen. Even like closed captioning
Mm-hmm.
is something that's really viable now, but could there be a source of closed captioning that does plain language or something like that? Those seem to be things that could happen. It's just whether we as a country would be willing to financially invest in that.
Yeah, right. Where's the investment? I think is a really, really good question. And I think that there is like an economic argument that you could make, and that's part of why at the beginning of the presentation I make that list of like who's all of the people who could benefit from this, right? I mean, let alone that the fact that there are 6 million people with intellectual disabilities in the United States, and that should be enough. But also, there are millions and millions of other people who would benefit from this kind of access. And I do think that it's much more likely that we will find this kind of access being integrated into public media because it will be funded by the federal government than you will find kind of private media integrating these kinds of things, I think is generally what I would expect to see. Because I think that despite the fact that somewhere between 18 and 30% of the population has a disability in the United States, people with disabilities are not seen as consumers in the United States. There's a whole lot of different kinds of stereotypes that exist around people with disabilities as not having money to contribute to the economy, which all of that is completely false. But because of that, people don't invest in infrastructure for people with disabilities in the private world because there's an assumption that there won't be money coming in because of it. So I think it is much more likely to come through kind of a public avenue than a private one.
You used the word accountable.
Mm-hmm.
How would a journalist be accountable? That is, would he be fined? Would he be jailed?
So I'm not thinking in terms of, I think, that kind of accountability. I'm thinking more along the lines of an update or a retraction. But I mean, I think definitely calling out newsrooms and often kind of raising a stink on social media does a lot, particularly around media these days, because newsrooms are struggling, right? And so any bad press is something that people take kind of very, very seriously around newsrooms. And so I think kind of having public dialogue around ways in which stories are misrepresentative or lean into stereotype or those kinds of things is kind of more what I was thinking. Yeah, so that is a workshop. So many of those journalists were coming from lots of different places, but several of them were coming from organizations that specifically have like disability beats, right? So like the 19th, for example, has its own disability beat that they run, as does upstate New York, WB, oh gosh, I can't remember the name of the, but there were, I mean, the number of journalists who are already working on disability beats who specifically wanted to do more around intellectual and developmental disability were the folks who tended to come to that workshop. And so we don't have the results of that workshop published yet, but we do have a series of best practices and all of the participants that will eventually go live on our website too, so that those journalists can be supported. That's a great question. All right. Oh, there's one back here. Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. Thank you for bringing that up. I mean, I think that is so important. There's a coalition that could be built, right, between people who are seeking access for disability-related reasons and people who are seeking access for language-related reasons, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I actually had the student who compiled the database of plain language guides for me was a student who also did a research project. She was a double major in disability studies and education and Spanish. And she actually did a whole bunch of work on the strategies that we use for English language learners in school, how they match up with the strategies around plain language, and why aren't we putting those things together. And so I think it's a really, really excellent point. And there's your economic argument too, right? More people. So it is a process that's done by a person right now. Actually, it's usually me. So there are people who are working on doing plain language translations via artificial intelligence. Actually, the story that I called out. Oh. Let me see if I can get it to go back. Oop. It says restart program. So we won't worry about going back. But the one story that I called out where I said that there was this diagram between the two, plain language and version, that story is actually about the way that algorithms think differently about what it means to make something plain versus what a human would think differently about simplifying writing. And so I'm personally of the opinion that I don't think that AI is there to do that work. You could certainly feed ChatGPT something and say, simplify this. I think the results are quite bad right now. I don't think that they're, because AI doesn't have context. But there are a number of people that I know who are working on specifically creating systems that will do plain language translation via AI. And so that definitely, there's a scale problem right now. If you have to hire a person to do a plain language translation, that's a huge investment. Maybe there's a world in which this AI tool is helpful for that. I'm a bit skeptical of that because I also think you need to be kind of rooted in communities. When I do plain language translations, I have expert readers with developmental disabilities who review what I do and then raise questions. And so I think that I'm skeptical of it. There are people who are working on it. There are people who are less skeptical than me.
I've seen AI translations of dense language. Usually they're about 1/3 pretty good.
Uh-huh.
1/3 gibberish.
Uh-huh.
And 1/3 plain wrong.
Yeah, right. I mean, exactly, right? I think that there's still a lot of problems with the way that AI thinks about information, that I think we're not quite there yet. I don't know that we'll ever be there, and I personally would much rather kind of invest in people learning this skill, but I also understand that I'm probably in a minority in that. Uh-huh. Mixed, yeah. I mean, so there's certainly, I have been asked to give graduate students training on how to do plain language, and this will typically be in an occupational therapy program or a speech language pathology program, right? A program where you're getting students who will eventually go out into the field and be working directly with people. In my own academic spaces, I will often, for example, when I submit an article to a journal to be published, I will often submit a plain language version of it and be like, can I also publish this with that? The results have been quite mixed. I will often get straight out rejections that this is not what our audience is interested in, this isn't who's reading the journal. And so there's definitely stigma attached to it, right? Because there is this assumption that if you write in a plain way, it's because you don't understand the complexities, right? And so often what I'll do, the kind of sleight of hand I'll do, is I'll write the complicated version, and then I will write the simplified version. And we'll try to submit both of those things. But yeah, it's slow going, I would say. It is a process, and I think a lot of it has to do with an assumption about who's in our intellectual communities, right? Why is it that we don't think that there will be a person with an intellectual disability in a classroom? Even though we have college programs all around the country, including at University of Toledo, that have people with intellectual disabilities in the classroom, right? I had a classroom of 10 for a small class that I was teaching, an upper level class last semester, and 5 of the students in that class were students with intellectual disabilities, right? And so all of the readings that I presented the original version, and I wrote a plain language translation of each one of those. That's a big investment of my time, certainly, and I don't know that there is a lot of investment on an infrastructural level to do that work. So it's been frustrating, I would say, but little steps, right? So I had a piece published in a philosophy journal last year that had an easy read version of it that had the icons and a single sentence, and that felt like a huge accomplishment, right? Because that was a journal that doesn't have anything to do with disability. That's not their kind of main focus. It's not the topic. And they were invested in making an accessible version of the piece. And so baby steps. But yeah, it's mixed. Certainly you get the response that you're talking about where it's like, well, that's not academic, right? That's not research-based. So yeah. Anything else? This was delightful. Phyllis and Darius, you want to close this out? Anything you want to say? Any last minute advice for the audience?
You want to go ahead?
We have a storytelling event coming up on Saturday at the Art Museum Pavilion. Anybody's invited to come. It's from 2 to 5. We also will have refreshments after. We're also having Toledo Ballet come and perform over there. And it's true stories about our lives.
Yeah, that's a great reminder, yeah. So this is our second annual, it's Stories of Disability Pride. It's Disability Pride Month here in July. So the Toledo Art Museum, their glass pavilion, they open it up for us, and we have 15 storytellers with intellectual disabilities share short 3 to 5 minute monologues about their life, and we have the Toledo Ballet Adaptive Program who will be performing as well. So that is this Saturday from 2 to 5. Great reminder, thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh, well, one day I'm doing something with the University of Toledo in the halftime. I'm doing against racism to speak up for everybody.
Yeah, right, so you want to use your position at the University of Toledo to talk about racism?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, wonderful.
Thank you.
Great. Anything else? Thanks all. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
Clap for you.